we economists really have no business being so goddamn cheerful. He was obviously talking about environmental issues. Now, Gideon wasn't a chap who used profanity lightly. This is a serious comment by a serious man about a significant issue. And the focus, and this is one I used to take off my talk, the focus is not just on the environment, but it is on the way economists have dealt with the issues of the environment. And of course, it doesn't apply to everybody, and there are lots of stellar exceptions. But he then goes on to say, toward the end of this paper, he says that if we seriously take on the issues that arise from the growth controversy, the controversy between the people he called the growth men and the doomsters. This is going back to the 1970s and the limits of growth and all that sort of thing, which a lot of people around here probably still remember. And in fact, the same issues are still with us. And he says, if we really take those issues seriously, we may succeed in reestablishing the reputation of economics as the dismal science. Well, that's something to look forward to. Now, the competition has become much keener since he wrote the Dismal competition. Earlier this month, was published a book by Ellen Weissman called Countdown, Our Last Best Hope for Survival on This Planet. And basically about the way in which the continuing population explosion was going to lead, as with every other species, into the collapse. And the question then was whether the species would survive in truncated form after the collapse. And he quotes sources from biological sources to say that the optimal carrying capacity of the planet is probably about 1.5 billion people. Current level is a little over 7 billion. Projections are for 9 to 11 billion by mid-century, and maybe as many as 16 billion by the end. So Weissman is really saying, we probably have a mass die-off coming here, folks. I don't think Malthus was quite that grim, but he's not the first. In 2006, James Lovelock said cheerfully, by the end of this century, the population of the planet will probably be down by about 90%. All right. Now, Lovelock has no further credibility since the Gaia hypothesis got him classified with crystal gazers and mappers of ley lines and assorted kooks. So we don't have to pay any attention to him, except that he was a scientist who made his career in the study of the evolution of planetary atmospheres. Now, it looks like he was wrong, simply that the Earth is not heating up nearly as fast as he thought. But it is. It is heating up, and so it really may be just a question of time. But that's about all I'm going to say directly about the economics of the environment. Seth told me I couldn't because he said we got Lester Brown coming in a week or two, and he knows far more about this topic than you ever will. So why don't you talk about something else? Well, it's true. It's true. It's fair enough. So what I did want to do then was to talk much more, again, about, take the lead that Gideon had provided, about economists and the growth controversy, and thus more generally about economists and economics. And the first point is that it is wrong to call economics the dismal science, quite wrong, because it's not a science. There's no way. Now we do have Nobel Prizes and all that, but let me draw your attention to Peter Higgs, right? Everybody knows about Peter Higgs and the Higgs boson and all that stuff, and there may actually be people in this room who know more about it and actually could talk about it sensibly. I'm not one of them, so I'm not going to. But we all know that it's extremely important, and we probably all know that Peter Higgs and Francois Englert got the Nobel in physics, was it earlier this month or at the end of September? Anyway, they got the 2013 prize for a proposition that they made, and others, back in 1964. That's nearly 50 years. Did it really take the Nobel Committee that long to figure out that this was pretty significant stuff? And the answer is no, of course not. What it did is it took the science that long to actually demonstrate that they were right. In other words, you don't get Nobel Prizes in the sciences for really nifty ideas. You only get the Nobel Prize when your really nifty idea has turned out to be confirmed by experiment or other rigorous observation. Okay, some of Einstein's prizes were held up for some time by that till there was time to observe the transit of Venus or things like that. So I want to underline the distinction between that and the prize in economic sciences, in which there's no necessity to demonstrate that your nifty idea was actually correct. And I'm going to give you a telling example of one in which it was rigorously demonstrated to be false, but they didn't give the prize back. Gunnar Myrdal and von Hayek shared the prize in 1974. Now, Gunnar Myrdal was an advocate of the welfare state, Swedish economist, progressive one. All right. Von Hayek wrote a bitter polemic called "The Road to Serfdom" against the welfare state. The committee decided to split the difference and let them share the prize. And Myrdal wrote quite an articulate essay as to why this showed that there shouldn't be a prize in economics for anybody. And he was right. It's not a science. It doesn't, and it's not a real prize either, because it's not given by the Nobel Foundation. It's given by the Swedish Central Bank. A bunch of economists, yeah. And it's given in economic sciences as an effort in what my colleague Ted Marmer calls persuasive definition, okay? Give it a label, and maybe people will think it is real. And there's a lot of that about. The most notorious example is creation science. Right. Christian Science has kind of faded into the background. Most of you have probably not heard about nursing science, but it's out there. Political science, well, we all agree politely to sort of say, yes, of course, but it's not really. So that's the tip-off. When something is called a science, like the prize in economic sciences, watch it. You're dealing with persuasive definition. And the purpose of that is to advance the status of economics and economists. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to want to do, but you shouldn't necessarily be taken into it. So I said the Myrdal-von Hayek case, I think, is pretty clear evidence that there's something wrong here. But I would emphasize that there's a whole lot of really, really good economics that has been rewarded with Nobel Prizes. There's some very brilliant stuff. There is some stuff which is somewhat less brilliant, names perhaps supplied on request, but I have enormous respect for the economists who come home, some of them, who come home with Nobel Prizes, but it's not a science. Now, I said there's an example where the proposition was actually refuted, okay? There is a thing called the Black-Scholes Equation, for which Myron Scholes and Robert Merton got the prize in 1997. This, Fisher Black died before the prize could be given. That's why it's the Black-Scholes equation, but he didn't get the prize. This enables you, with some really, really nifty math, to predict the proper value of options for a whole raft of different financial assets, okay? And if you can predict those reliably, then you can identify when markets are slightly out of whack, the options are priced too high or too low, and you can go in and short them, sell them short if they're too high, and buy them if they're too low, and you can make a killing. So they organized a company called, a hedge fund actually, called Long Run Capital Management in 1974, and it made squillions. And it made it by very high risk bets on which they said, well, it's not really all that risky because we've got the math that says we know where we are, we know what we're doing. It's okay. And they were, I think the group were up about $5 billion with investments, gambles basically, in the hundreds of millions. They were heavily leveraged by the time they got the prize. Well, that was in 97. A year later, the company was wound up. They were bust. The markets turned bad. Their equation didn't work. It's kind of like, you're up there in a plane and the laws of aerodynamics suddenly cease to hold. That's just not a good place to be. And that was the end of it. They were not asked to give back the prize, but the point is that the elaborate mathematical framework which they had put together was not, and at the time of the prize, was not tested, but the markets did arrange for a test, and it flunked, okay? The financial historian Niall Ferguson at Harvard has quite a good chapter on this with variety of reasons why things went wrong, and I'm not going to go into those. The point I want to get at is, the one I want to underline is that being called economic sciences and getting Nobels and all that good stuff does not a science make. Or as the clown says in Twelfth Night, "Culculus non fecit monachum." The cowl does not make the monk. Okay, so why not? And so what? Does it matter? Well, it does, because I think that one of the problems that economics has is that the efforts by economists to establish themselves as real scientists by the use of really nifty and really complex and really elaborate and really good mathematics, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the reality that they're trying to explain. And that's kind of what happened to the Black-Scholes equation, and it's a point emphasized by Gideon at the end of his paper on economists and the growth controversy, which I will make sure that Seth puts up on the website. So making a category mistake is serious. Now, why does this happen? And again, I would underline, it does not prevent economists from making some really, really good intellectual contributions and sometimes some really good intellectual contributions to policy. But there is another one. The Black-Scholes equation turned out to have a flaw. The other guy who found a flaw, in his own words, was Alan Greenspan. Remember him? Yeah. A guy who learned his economics from the rational expectations school in the 70s and 80s, and that was inspired also by Ayn Rand. Apparently he really was. Anyway, we know where that led. So these things do matter. Now, why is it a category mistake? Because, and this was laid out very nicely by Neil Postman, that there are processes and there are practices in the world. Processes are the activities in the natural world which repeat themselves under constant conditions and are susceptible to scientific investigation and prediction. Okay? The practices of human communities, on the other hand, evolve in a historical context. They have histories, and they change through time. You don't necessarily have to be able to do experiments to find processes that operate under constant conditions. Astronomy became a science long before anybody could do any experiments with it. You just careful, precise observation, and the more careful and the more precise the observation. But you didn't need necessarily elaborate mathematics, although evolved that way with celestial mechanics. But Eratosthenes gave us a tolerably accurate estimate of the circumference of the Earth. Oh, not quite 2,000 years before Columbus sailed. And every educated person knew it. But he did it with, professional runners looking down a well, measuring the angle of a shadow in Alexandria. Nothing elaborate, just a really, really clever guy. And I'm still left wondering, since everybody in fact knew what the circumference of the Earth was, what was going on with Columbus and the Spanish crown? The kid's story that we're told can't be right. It doesn't make any sense. But I don't know what the real story is. There's some backstory back there that maybe some clever historian will someday winkle out. Anyway, practices in human communities, and where economics is about predicting human behavior, evolve through time, as I mentioned. They evolve from one place to another. They're not consistent. They're not like the temperature necessary to boil water, things like that. So the techniques for studying them are fundamentally historical, not traditionally scientific. And just adding more math to your model doesn't make it any more realistic. You really have to think about how these processes change. And in a way, I think economics made the mistake of following Democritus, who brought us the concept of the atom, rather than of Heraclitus, who said, it's been poetically rendered as it's impossible to step into the same river twice. What he actually said was, all things flow, nothing is static. Okay? And that's, I think, the mindset that you have to bring into economics. And when you don't do that, I think you get into trouble. Now, economics focuses on incentives very closely. It worries a lot about incentives, as my friend Jim Marone, a political scientist at Brown, has written neatly, economists spend too much time on this. This is a dangerous game. You should never, as he put it, never underestimate the power of incentives, never overestimate the ability of an economist to tell which way you're going to go. You're going to run into a whole bunch of unexpected consequences.